Now a retired English professor from North Carolina State University in Raleigh, she lives with her husband, journalist Hal Crowther, who, by the way, is also speaking at this year's festival. This author's appearance at the 2011 Savannah Book Festival has been graciously sponsored by Southern Scribe and by Mr. and Mrs. Mike Powers. Please join me in welcoming Lee Smith to the 2011 Savannah Book Festival.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody for being here. I should say, she said that I started writing when I was a child, which was true, and selling my stories door to door for a nickel, which was also true. One of my best friends from childhood, my childhood in Grundy, Virginia, is here, and I got in a whole lot of trouble for writing an editorial in this little newspaper I was selling door to door when I was 9 years old, I think. And the editorial was against her uncle, George McGuire, who was their neighbor. And the name of it was George McGuire is Too Grumpy. and this is my friend Carol, who is here, who was a wonderful piano player. We both took lessons from Mrs. Ruth Boyd. And I also wrote an editorial about Mrs. Ruth Boyd. And it said, and I remember the main part of it said, Mrs. Ruth Boyd is a mean piano teacher. She hits your knuckles with a pencil and her house smells like meatloaf all the time. So this was the start of my career. But I'm very happy to be here and very happy to be reading from this book, which is named Mrs. Darcy and the Blue-Eyed Stranger, because what it is a collection of new and selected stories. And what that means is some of them I wrote when I was really very young, like I think the earliest one is maybe from 1967. And some of them I wrote right before this book went to press, including the one most recently written, which is set on at Fernandina Beach, actually. So I don't have a Savannah story, but I've got a Fernandina Beach story. And I am not ever going to write a memoir because I get really bored fast with facts. This gave me a lot of trouble when I was briefly a journalist. It's a big problem, but I love to write fiction, love to write short stories, and when I look at this book, it gives me enormous pleasure because this is probably as close as I will ever get to a memoir, in that each story brings something very vivid back to me about my own life and how old I was when I wrote that story, and where I was living, and how all my children were, and where I sat to write, and what I could see out the window there, and just who I was, you know, at that particular time in my life, you know, where I lived, who I was married to, you know, whatever. It all just, you know, comes back with this immediacy. And also, you know, when you write fiction, it's fiction, but there's also really something about every single thing that you write, which is coming right out of your own self and who you are at that moment in time. I mean, it's really you. And you can get right back to it immediately by reading these old stories. And so I love to do that. I have a quotation at the beginning of the book from one of my favorite writers, Eudora Welty, and it's about this. It's about writing. So let me just read you this. This is from her wonderful book about writing named One Writer's Beginnings. Writing a story or a novel is one way of discovering sequence in experience, of stumbling upon cause and effect in the happenings of a writer's own life. This has been the case with me. Connections slowly emerge, like distant landmarks you are approaching, cause and effect begin to align themselves, draw closer together. Experiences too indefinite of outline in themselves to be recognized for themselves connect and are identified as a larger shape. And suddenly a light is thrown back, as when your train makes a curve, showing that there's been a mountain of meaning rising behind you on the way you've come, is rising there still, proven now through retrospect. Writing fiction has developed in me an abiding respect for the unknown in the human lifetime, and a sense of where to look for the threads, how to follow, how to connect, find in the thick of the tangle what clear line persists. The strands are all there. To the memory, nothing is ever really lost. The events in our lives happen in a sequence in time, but in their significance to us, they find their own order. The time as we know it subjectively is often the chronology that stories and novels follow. It is the continuous thread of revelation. And so writing for me has been a great pleasure. And I think, as for many of you, and I think really publishing is maybe one of the last reasons to write. I mean, it's just so wonderful. I have a friend who has died now, Peter Taylor, who always said, I never know what I think till I read what I've written, which is true too. So there are many, many reasons to write, whether we're writing fiction or poetry or keeping a journal or just jotting stuff down and stuffing it in the pocket of our jeans, you know. It's a good thing to do. I want to say one thing too about the name of this book, which is Mrs. Darcy and the Blue-Eyed Stranger, because, you know, when you're doing an anthology, it's customary to just name the anthology for one of the stories, and that's just one of my favorites. That one's set at Polly's Island, so that's just one of my favorite stories, and I named it that. It turned out to be a huge mistake. I didn't know this until I was invited to be the keynote speaker at the American Booksellers Association in Boston before this book came out. And so my publisher is giving away, you know, free copies of the advanced reader's copy. And all these librarians are getting real excited, and they all line up in my line. I think, oh, this is good. They like my work, right? So the first one that comes forward says, oh, I can't wait to read this book. I just love Jane Austen. And she grabbed the book and she ran out. And I thought, well, that's a crazy librarian. But then the second one came up and she did the same thing too. She grabbed the book and she said, oh goodness, don't you just love Pride and Prejudice? And I said, well, yeah, I do, but why are you telling me this? And it turns out I didn't even know that there is this whole industry of Jane Austen spin-off books. You know, because there's such a vogue for Jane Austen book clubs, all this kind of thing. So if you go in a big bookstore now, you can find a display with books named things like Mr. Darcy and the City of the Undead, you know, Mrs. Darcy and the whatever. I never thought of that. So if you're looking for Jane Austen, don't buy this book. By then, it was too late to name it, of course, anything else. I didn't want to name it that anyway. Well, my favorite story in here is the story that's set in Fernandina Beach. It's actually a novella, and the name of it, I wanted to name the whole book the name of the story, which is Stevie and Mama. And the marketing people at the publisher said, well, no one who's ever picked up the New Yorker would possibly pick up a book named Stevie and Mama. And to which my husband said, well, why don't you change it to Stephen and Mother? But no, it was too late. Stevie and Mama really is one of my favorite stories. There's some stories in here now, the new ones, which tend to be stories about aging and long marriages and stuff that I never even thought about or didn't know anything about when I was writing the first stories. And Stevie and Mama is one of those, and House Tour is one of those about long marriages. I'm going to read you only one, since I'm in Georgia, I'm going to read you only one paragraph from Stevie and Mama, which is too complicated to get into, as any long marriage is, right? But This is just one paragraph. It's about a woman named Roxy. If Roxy actually had to say what her best trait is, she would say reliable, hardworking. That's pathetic, isn't it? Even mules are hardworking. Horses, even dogs. But Roxy's got a nice figure too and a good heart, which is capable of intense love. So much love that it has surprised her and even scared her to death upon occasion when it has caused her to do the wildest things. Things she would have thought nobody her age would ever do, especially a realtor. Okay, now you can just think about that. But I think the stories for me, that, as I say, they're always somehow really linked to who I am in my own life. Oftentimes, when you're young and you just begin to write, your stories and novels spring from all the most intense dramas and traumas and passions of your own real life. You just can't, there's a reason you want to write and you just can't wait to do that. But the problem is, if you're going to write for your whole life long, which I have, you know, after about 3 books, you've used up your life. Big problem. So, therefore, you take to doing other things. One of my recent novels on Agate Hill, for instance, is a Civil War novel, which allowed me to do all sorts of really interesting research and enter into another time and place. But there's still sometimes things that happen that cause you to write a story. This is one. I'm going to read you a little cut version of the beginning of this story named House Tour, because I see a lot of beautiful houses here. And I know that, I'm sure the Historic Society, as it does in their own town, Hillsborough, North Carolina, you know, have many house tours at different times for various house tours, garden tours, whatever, to raise money. My husband and I live in a really old house, and it looks like the kind of a house, it's on the main street, it looks like the kind of house that would be on a house tour, but it's not. Because we're both writers, we both work at home, and the house is a wreck, it's just a mess. And nobody would want to see it. No. So they always ask us, and we always say no. And finally, my husband told the lady that came, he said, listen, he said, the only way that this house will ever be on the tour is if the master of the house has one way or another left the home. And she said, thank you. Just went running out the door. So anyway, so it's never actually been on the house tour, but 2 years ago, I kind of forgot that it was the Christmas house tour day. It was the Christmas parade and so on. And I was writing a novel, as I always am, upstairs in the attic. And my husband was, thank God, gone somewhere. And I heard this little noise down in the front hall. It was like, and I just could not figure out what it was. So I thought, well, you know, I just went on writing. And I have a good imagination, but not that good. And when it went again, I thought, well, there's somebody in the hall. So I went, you know, down the stairs, and I looked, and the whole downstairs of the house was filled with a bus full of red hat ladies who had come on a bus from Gastonia, North Carolina, to the, you know, historic, to the house tour. And there they were. They were just looking at everything. And unfortunately, that day, the house looked like hell. And not only that, but there was a broken dishwasher sitting in the middle of the hall. And there was one of these big wide main halls, you know, broken dishwasher. And not only that, they had just had a wine sale at the wine shop, and I thought 2 cases of wine were sitting on the middle there. Anyway, so a lot of things happened, and I was inspired to write the story. But, you know, in a story, what you have to do is kind of up the ante, because any string of events is not of interest in itself. Even if it is a busload of red hat ladies from Gastonia, it's got to mean something to the person who is telling the story. It's got to mean something to somebody. It doesn't have to. A story is about the point at which events influence and affect and change